Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know we love tackling complex issues, and the one you guys have sent us tons of research on is a really important one. We're talking about school absenteeism,
Yeah.
specifically for those kiddos in that 5 to 17 age range, elementary, middle, high school. And right off the bat, looking at what you sent in, it seems like it's so much more than just taking a day off here or there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, sure, every kid misses a day or two every now and then. But the research you sent paints a really clear picture that when a kid is excessively absent, it can be a big red flag. It's connected to some serious
Yeah,
problems.
you're talking about violence, substance abuse.
Right. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Injuries, too. And even more concerning, things like suicide attempts, risky sexual behavior, and even teenage pregnancy.
Yeah, and when you lay it all out like that, it's really eye-opening.
Hmm.
But your sources also highlight that it's not just those really intense issues. It's tied to a whole host of other struggles that kids face too, like asthma and anxiety and depression, and even things like what are called disruptive behavior disorders.
Exactly. Absenteeism is tangled up with so many other issues. And the sheer scale of this problem is something that really jumps out from the research you sent. One study found that something like 7% of fourth and sixth graders are missing at least 5 days of school every single month. And that's not even counting skipping classes or being late.
Wow, I had no idea it was that high.
Yeah, it's a lot. And it gets even more significant in high school. Over half of high schoolers say they skip class at least sometimes. And for about 13% of them, it's a regular thing.
Okay, so we're talking about potentially a huge chunk of high schoolers who are missing significant amounts of school. That has to have some serious implications down the road.
It does. To put that in perspective, the research you sent shows that the dropout rate for high school students, for 16 to 24-year-olds, it's a little over 10%, is actually higher than the rates of most major childhood mental disorders, which usually fall under 5%.
So that really drives home the point that this is a really widespread issue. It's affecting a significant portion of our young people.
Right. So our mission today is to really dig into this complex problem. You've given us a lot to work with. We're going to explore how different fields approach this question of why young people aren't consistently in school. We'll be looking at psychology, social and criminal justice, education, and even some areas like child development, family studies, medicine. There's a lot to unpack here.
All right, so it seems like we have all these different experts
Yeah.
all looking at the same problem, but maybe they're looking at it through different lenses.
Right, exactly. And right away, the research you sent points to a major challenge here, the lack of a common language.
Okay, so even just defining the problem is a hurdle.
It can be. One of the biggest obstacles in addressing school absenteeism is that different fields use different terms and definitions to describe what might seem like the same basic problem.
So then how do we even compare what they're saying? How do we make sense of the research if everyone's calling it something different?
It gets really difficult to compare findings across different areas of research, and it leads to inconsistent approaches when we're trying to help these kids. So today, a big part of what we'll do is try to bridge those gaps in how we define the problem.
All right, so where do we even begin? Where do we start this exploration? It seems like psychology might be a good place to start, figuring out why a child might not want to go to school.
Yeah, that makes sense. Psychological approaches often focus on the individual child's symptoms and the things that are contributing to their absence that are kind of close by, what they call proximal factors. And then the interventions they use are really tailored to that individual child.
So it's very much focused on what's going on with that one particular kid.
Right. You'll come across terms like school phobia, which basically means that the child is afraid to go to school. That fear is usually triggered by something specific within the school environment. Maybe it's a certain person or even a loud noise that makes them really anxious.
Okay, so it's almost like a very specific phobia, but related to school. And then there's separation anxiety, which I think most people are familiar with. Those younger kids who have trouble being away from their parents.
Exactly. And in this context, it refers to a really heightened sense of worry about being separated from their main caregivers. And that then turns into this strong reluctance to actually go to school.
So they just don't want to leave mom or dad.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. And the research you sent also mentions school refusal, which sounds a bit broader than those other terms.
It is broader. School refusal is a term that kind of covers those anxiety-driven reasons for not going to school. So that includes things like panic attacks that a kid might have at school, or maybe they have social anxiety and that's really hard to deal with in a school setting, or even just a more general feeling of distress about being at school.
So school refusal is kind of like an umbrella term for all those anxiety-related reasons.
Right, exactly. And then you've got another term, which is school refusal behavior, or SRB.
Ah, SRB. Now, how is that different from just plain school refusal?
So SRB is the most all-encompassing of these terms. It really refers to any behavior where a kid is motivated to avoid school, or maybe they just have a really hard time staying in class for the whole day. And importantly, it's not just about anxiety. It could be caused by a whole range of different
Oh,
things.
okay, so it's like the biggest bucket. It includes all sorts of reasons why a kid might not be at school.
Got it. So we're really talking about a spectrum here. All these different reasons, often rooted in what the child is feeling and experiencing. And the research you sent highlights some specific child symptoms that psychologists often focus on, like anxiety and depression and fear, which makes sense. But then also things like perfectionism and even manipulativeness.
Yeah, that's right. It's a pretty diverse set of emotional states, and it goes beyond just feelings. There are certain personality traits that have been linked to school absenteeism as well. Things like being introverted or not being very open to new experiences, or having lower levels of what we call agreeableness and conscientiousness. Those are all traits that could definitely make school a tougher place to navigate.
Right. And lower emotional stability as well. Basically, all these traits suggest that a child's personality can play a big role in how they cope with all the demands and the pressures of going to school every day.
So it's not just about being sick or having a family emergency. It can be about how a child's personality interacts with the whole school experience.
Right. And here's where it gets even more interesting. It's not just about those internal characteristics, those personality traits. The psychological perspective also looks at what we call proximal factors. Those are the more immediate, kind of in-your-face reasons why a child might avoid school.
So like what's happening right then and there that makes them not want to be in school?
Exactly. Psychologists often talk about four key proximal factors. The first one is avoiding negative feelings. This could be anything from anxiety or depression that's triggered by the school environment itself. Maybe certain situations at school just make them feel really bad.
Okay, so just wanting to avoid feeling crummy. And what's the second factor?
The second one is escaping situations that are unpleasant or where the child feels like they're being judged. So that might be things like being bullied or being afraid to fail in class, or even just not wanting to deal with social situations that feel awkward or uncomfortable.
Yeah, that makes sense. School can be a pressure cooker sometimes. What of the third factor?
Number three is seeking attention from their caregivers by staying home. Sometimes staying home can be a way for a child to get the attention and care they might be craving.
So it's less about hating school and more about wanting to be with mom or dad.
Hmm.
Okay. And what's the last one?
The fourth one is going after things they enjoy outside of school. So maybe they'd rather hang out with their friends, or play video games, or just do anything but sit in a classroom. It's about seeking out those rewards that are more immediately gratifying.
Makes sense. Those are all really understandable reasons why a kid might not want to be at school. So what do psychologists typically do when they try to help these kids? What kinds of interventions do they use?
They often use approaches that are really focused on the individual child and their specific symptoms. A really common one is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
CBT.
Okay.
And what does that involve?
CBT involves several different parts. First, you have to educate the child about their anxiety, help them understand what's going on. Then you might teach them some relaxation techniques like breathing exercises to help them manage those physical symptoms of anxiety.
So give them some tools to calm themselves down.
Right. And then there's the cognitive therapy part, where you help them challenge and change those negative thought patterns they might have. And there's also the exposure part. This is where you gradually expose them to the things they're afraid of, but in a safe and controlled way to help them overcome their fears.
So basically you're helping them face their fears little by little.
Exactly. And then there's also supportive therapy, where you provide a safe space for them to talk about what they're going through. And sometimes they involve the parents, teaching them how to use positive reinforcement to encourage the child to go to school.
So get the whole family on board with the plan.
Right. And in some cases, medication might be considered, too, as part of a bigger treatment plan. The overall goals are to help the child learn how to manage their anxiety and to improve their school attendance and to make sure the parents are involved in supporting the child through the process.
So it's really a team effort, and it's
Well,
all about giving the child the tools and support they need
Yeah.
to be able to handle those difficult feelings.
Right. But the research you sent also points out some limitations to this purely psychological approach. There are some criticisms.
Okay, so what are some of the drawbacks of focusing solely on the child's internal world.
So, one major criticism is that when you put so much emphasis on internalizing symptoms like anxiety and depression, you might miss those kids who have what are called externalizing problems. So, things like conduct disorder or ADHD.
Okay, so kids who act out rather than internalize.
Exactly. And these kids often get excluded from both research studies and the interventions that are designed to help kids with school refusal. Even though these kinds of behaviors, these externalizing behaviors, are pretty common among kids who are absent a lot.
So if we're only looking for anxiety and depression, we might be missing a whole other group of kids who need help.
Exactly. We might be overlooking a whole bunch of students who are struggling with attendance, but their problems just don't fit that neat little box of school refusal.
So that's a really important point. We need to broaden our view. What's the second big criticism?
The second one is that psychological approaches often don't pay enough attention to all the other factors that can affect a child's attendance, particularly the things that are happening at school and in the community.
So it's not just about what's going on in the child's head, it's about the environment they're in too.
Right. While psychologists do consider the family and the child's ethnic background and even the overall climate of the school, those bigger systemic influences often get kind of pushed to the side.
So even if you're working with a child one-on-one to help them deal with their anxiety about school, if the school itself feels unsafe, or if there are things happening in the community that are pulling the child away from school, that therapy might not be enough.
Exactly. You have to look at the bigger picture. And there's one more criticism that's important to mention. Some people argue that the language that psychologists use can sometimes be problematic. All that clinical terminology can make it sound like not going to school is always a psychological problem.
So it can pathologize something that might have other explanations.
Right. It might not always be an accurate reflection of what's really going on, especially when those external factors, like what's happening at school or in the community, are playing a big role. And this leads us nicely into the next perspective we need to consider, which is the social and criminal justice approach.
Okay, so now we're shifting gears a bit. Moving from the internal world of the child to those broader societal factors. How do these approaches view school absenteeism?
These approaches tend to focus more on rule-breaking behaviors, things that might be seen as delinquent. And they really zero in on those wider contextual factors. They also look at interventions that involve the legal system or the community.
So they're looking at things like truancy laws and what happens when kids break those laws.
Exactly. Some key terms you'll see here are delinquency, which often refers to conduct disorder. It's about those behaviors that break rules or laws. And then there's truancy, which has a very specific legal definition. It means that a child is absent from school without a valid excuse.
Okay, so now we're seeing absenteeism framed as a potential legal issue rather than just a psychological or emotional one. What kinds of things in a child's environment do these approaches focus on?
They really focus on the social factors that affect a child's well-being. Things like homelessness, that's a huge barrier to going to school regularly. The research shows that homeless youth have much lower rates of attendance.
That makes sense. If you don't have a stable place to live, it's hard to prioritize getting to school every day.
Right. And poverty is another big factor. Kids from low-income families are more likely to miss school. Teenage pregnancy is a factor too because young mothers are less likely to finish school.
All really tough situations that can make it incredibly hard for a kid to stay on track with their education. What else do they look at?
Things like what they call neighborhood disorganization. This basically means that the community is unstable, maybe there's a lot of crime, and people aren't really looking out for each other. That can lead to kids not having enough supervision, and people in the community might not do much about truancy.
So it's not just about the family, it's about the whole environment the child is growing up in.
Right. And then there's family chaos. That can include things like moving around a lot, maybe experiencing abuse or neglect, or having a lot of conflict at home, or maybe the parents are struggling with substance abuse. All of these things can really disrupt a child's life and make it hard to focus on school.
Yeah, it sounds like any one of those things would be incredibly difficult for a child to cope with, let alone all of them together.
And the last thing they look at is the influence of peers. When kids hang out with friends who are getting in trouble with the law, they're much more likely to drop out of school themselves, especially if they don't have other positive connections, like being involved in sports or clubs.
So it's about who they're spending their time with and what those friends are modeling for them.
Exactly. So we've got all these social factors that can pull a child away from school. Now, how do the interventions that come from this perspective differ from the psychological interventions we talked about earlier?
Yeah, that's a good question. They seem to be approaching the problem from completely different angles.
They are. The interventions here tend to be a lot broader. They often focus on changing things at a system level and providing support throughout the community. This might mean investing in early childhood education programs to help kids get a good start, or providing support services to families to help them develop strong parenting skills.
Okay, so trying to give families the tools and resources they need to create a more stable home environment.
Right. And there are also programs that try to connect families with social services if their child is having attendance problems. And then there are legal strategies too, like having police do truancy sweeps in the community to find kids who are skipping school.
So sometimes it's about enforcing the law and making sure kids are actually in school.
Right. But there are some limitations to this approach as well, just like with the psychological perspective.
Okay, so what are some of the drawbacks of this approach? It seems very focused on those external factors in the legal system.
It is. And one of the main criticisms is that it doesn't always pay enough attention to what's happening inside the school itself. And it doesn't always consider the parents' beliefs about education.
So it's a bit of a top-down approach.
Yeah. It can be a bit broad brush. It doesn't always account for all those subtle things that can be going on in a particular school or family.
So it might miss some of those nuances. And this brings us to the third perspective, which is the educational approach. How do schools themselves understand and try to deal with absenteeism?
The educational approach is interesting because it's really influenced by both the social criminal justice and the psychological perspectives. You'll often see schools adopting policies that come straight out of the legal system, like defining truancy in a very specific way, and they might even refer kids to the juvenile justice system if they miss too much school.
So that's that social criminal justice influence.
Right, but at the same time, schools often offer counseling services and therapy to students who are struggling with things like anxiety and depression.
So there's that psychological influence as well.
Exactly. Schools are kind of stuck in the middle, trying to balance those two different worlds. And the research you sent really highlights how hard it is for schools to tell the difference between school refusal and truancy when they're actually dealing with these two.
So in the real world, those categories might not be so clear-cut.
Exactly. Teachers and administrators often have a really hard time figuring out whether a kid is skipping school because they're anxious or because they just don't want to be there.
So it's not always easy to label a kid as school refuser or truant. There might be a whole mix of things going on.
Right. The research really points out that those simple labels aren't always accurate. They don't capture the whole picture. You might have a kid who skips a class because they're terrified of giving a presentation, but they also might skip because they think the subject is boring. It's not always one or the other.
So it's messy. It's
Yeah.
real life. Okay, so what do schools typically focus on when they're trying to address absenteeism? What are some of the key things they look at?
They often look at things like violence and victimization at school, especially bullying. The research shows that a lot of kids avoid certain activities or even whole days of school because they're scared of being hurt or harassed.
So if kids don't feel safe, they're not going to want to be there.
Right. And kids who are bullied are much more likely to feel unsafe at school and to skip. Another big factor is the overall climate of the school. Do kids feel connected to the school and the adults there? Do they feel safe? Do they feel supported and respected? Is there a sense of flexibility in the school?
Yeah, that overall vibe of the school has to play a big role.
It really does. Those things are all linked to attendance and whether a kid is likely to drop out. And then another huge factor is how involved parents are in their child's education.
Parent involvement makes a huge difference. We hear that a lot. But the research also talks about some of the reasons why parents might not be very involved. And it's not always just about not caring.
Right. There are lots of reasons why parents might not be very involved. Sometimes it's about language barriers or cultural differences that make it hard to communicate with the school. Maybe the family has different beliefs about the importance of education.
So there can be a clash between the school's values and the family's values.
Right. And there can be mistrust between the parents and the school. Maybe there's a history of conflict. And sometimes immigrant families might be resistant to the school's attempts to make their child more Americanized.
So it's about protecting their own culture and traditions.
Right. And then there are problems that come from the school side, too, like maybe teachers are absent a lot, or maybe there's racism or discrimination happening at the school. Those things can make parents less willing to be involved.
So it's not always the parents' fault. There can be real problems within the school system that make it hard for parents to connect.
Okay, so we've talked about the factors that schools look at. What kinds of things do they actually do to try to improve attendance?
Oh, they try lots of different things. And they often borrow ideas from both the psychological and the social criminal justice worlds. To deal with violence and bullying, they often offer counseling services for both the victims and the bullies. They might have conflict resolution programs to teach kids how to solve disagreements peacefully.
So trying to create a more harmonious environment.
Right. And they might have social skills training to help kids learn how to interact better with each other. And they might increase supervision, especially in the hallways and other places where bullying might happen. Sometimes they even have to increase security measures to keep kids safe. So sometimes it's about taking a really hands-on approach to safety.
Right. And then they often have anti-bullying programs where they set clear rules about bullying and what the consequences are. They monitor how kids are interacting with each other. And they might even have to mediate between kids who are having problems. And they often focus on developing social skills for kids who are doing the bullying.
So it's about prevention and intervention. Okay, so that's how they deal with bullying and violence. What about improving that overall school climate we talked about?
To make the school feel like a better place to be, they might focus on making the curriculum more engaging and relevant to kids' lives. They might offer more flexible schedules to accommodate different kids' needs.
So kind of customizing things a bit more.
Right. And they might try to build traditions and have school-wide events to create a stronger sense of community. And they also want to make sure the rules are clear and fair and that they're applied consistently to everyone.
So making sure everyone knows what's expected and that things are fair. Okay, what about getting those parents more involved?
To get parents more on board, they often try to improve communication between the home and the school. Maybe they'll provide translators for families who don't speak English. Sometimes they'll even do home visits to build relationships with families. They try to make it easier for parents to participate in school activities. And they're trying to hire more diverse staff so that the school reflects the community better.
So trying to break down those barriers that can make it hard for parents to be involved.
Exactly. They're also trying different things like changing the role of the homeroom teacher so that they can identify attendance problems earlier. And they might have peer attendance monitoring programs where kids encourage each other to come to school. And they often use rewards for good attendance to motivate kids.
So finding ways to incentivize good attendance makes sense.
And they might even have summer bridge programs to help kids make that transition between grade levels. And then finally, a lot of schools now have health programs right there in the school.
So kids could get basic health care without having to leave school.
Right. These programs can help with things like asthma management, hygiene, and even getting vaccinations. And they can help kids manage chronic health conditions that might be making it hard for them to come to school.
So schools are really trying a lot of different things to try to address this issue. They're drawing on a lot of different ideas. But the research you sent seems to suggest that while these efforts are important, they're often kind of piecemeal. Like there's no unifying framework that ties everything together. And that's where this interdisciplinary model comes in. It's trying to offer a more comprehensive way to understand and address school absenteeism.
Exactly. The research you shared really highlights this need for a common ground. We need a model that bridges those gaps between all these different disciplines that are looking at this problem.
Because right now it's like everyone's speaking different language.
Right. And the research findings don't always line up because people are using different definitions and different approaches. So this new model is trying to create that common starting point. And it aims to be comprehensive, flexible, and easy for both researchers and practitioners to use.
Okay, so it's trying to be practical and useful for people who are actually working with these kids. What's the first big thing this model focuses on?
The first thing is getting everyone on the same page with terminology and definitions. We need to be able to talk about this problem in a clear and consistent way.
So we can all understand each other. Makes sense. What are some of the key distinctions that this model makes?
One of the most important distinctions is between non-problematic and problematic absenteeism. Non-problematic absenteeism is basically those absences that are legitimate and unavoidable. Things like when a kid is sick and has a doctor's note, or a real family emergency, or a religious holiday.
Okay, so the reasons are valid, and both the parents and the school agree that the absence is okay.
Right. And this category also includes those times when a kid is maybe late a few times, but then they fix the problem quickly. It's not a big deal. And it's important to point out that this model specifically excludes what's called school withdrawal. That's when parents are intentionally keeping their kids out of school without a good reason.
Okay, so that's different. That's a whole other issue.
Right. So that's non-problematic absenteeism. Now, how about problematic absenteeism? How does the model define that?
Yeah, this seems like a really important piece. We need to know what we're actually talking about when we say problematic.
Absolutely. And the model doesn't just define it in one way. It actually uses a multifaceted definition, recognizing that it's not just about a specific number of days.
So it's more nuanced than that.
It is. There are actually three criteria. The first one is missing at least 25% of total school time for at least 2 weeks in a row. The second one is having a really hard time getting to school for at least 2 weeks. Like it's really disrupting the child's or the family's routine. And the third one is being absent for at least 10 days total during any 15-week period during the school year. And anytime a kid misses at least 25% of a school day, that counts as a full absence.
Okay, so that third criteria is basically saying that they're missing a significant chunk of school overall.
Right. It's a minimum of 15% absence overall.
Okay, so this is a really specific and comprehensive definition. It's looking at full days missed, but also those times when a kid misses a large part of the day. And it's also looking at patterns over time.
Exactly. So why go through all this trouble to come up with this really detailed definition? There are some really important advantages to having this clarity. First, it doesn't favor any one perspective or any specific labels like school refusal or truancy.
So it's kind of neutral. It doesn't come with all that baggage.
Right. It's a good starting point for everyone, no matter what their background is. Second, that 2-week criterion helps to weed out those absences that are just temporary or that resolve themselves quickly. It helps us focus on the more persistent problems.
So we're not getting bogged down in those minor blips. We're looking at the bigger picture.
Right. And third, it includes all different forms of problematic absenteeism. It's not just about full-day absences. And that means we can identify problems and start interventions earlier.
So we're catching those issues before they spiral out of control.
Exactly. And because we're using this rolling 15-week window, we can spot those patterns of absenteeism that might not be obvious if we were just looking at yearly totals. Like maybe a kid is only absent a lot for a few weeks at a time, but those few weeks are really disruptive.
So we're not just looking at the overall quantity, but also the timing and the impact of those absences.
Right. And what's really groundbreaking here is that by moving beyond all that field-specific jargon, we finally have a common language. Now researchers can actually compare their findings and build on each other's work.
So we can start making some real progress instead of everyone being stuck in their own silos.
Exactly. And practitioners can actually use those research findings to develop more effective interventions because now they have a clear understanding of what they're dealing with. It's a fundamental shift in how we approach this problem.
Wow, that's huge. Just getting that clear definition seems like a massive step forward.
Yeah.
So what's the second key element of this interdisciplinary model?
The second key element is comprehensiveness. It's recognizing that to really understand school absenteeism, you have to look at all the different factors that might be contributing to it. And those factors operate at all different levels of a child's life.
So we're talking about the child themselves, but also their family, their peers, their school, their community. It's the whole ecosystem.
It is. The model breaks it down into 6 key categories: the child, the parents, the family dynamics, the peer relationships, the school environment, and the community. And the research you sent actually includes a table, Table 2, that lists all those different factors within each category.
So it's a really detailed breakdown of all the things that might be playing a role.
It is. And they make a distinction between those factors that have a direct impact on attendance, the proximal factors, and those that have a more indirect impact, the distal factors.
So some things are like those immediate triggers, and others are more like background influences.
Right. And then they also have a figure, Figure 1, that visually shows how all these different spheres of influence are connected to school absenteeism.
So you can actually see how it all fits together like a web.
Exactly. And one of the most important insights here is that these factors are often interconnected. They don't exist in isolation. So, for example, you might have a child who is struggling with anxiety, and their parent is also dealing with mental health issues. That can create a really tough situation for the whole family.
So the child's problems are intertwined with the family's problems.
Right. Or maybe a child is being bullied at school and they start hanging out with other kids who skip class. That can create a kind of negative peer group that reinforces those behaviors.
So one problem can lead to another, and it can become this vicious cycle.
Exactly. And the model also emphasizes that these relationships go both ways. Absenteeism isn't just a result of these other factors. It can actually make those problems worse too.
So it's not just a symptom, it can be a cause as well.
Right. For example, if a child is absent from school for a long time, it can create more conflict within the family. Maybe the parents are disagreeing about how to handle the situation, or maybe they're stressed out about trying to manage everything.
So the absence itself is putting a strain on the family.
Right. And it can also make it harder for the child to reconnect with the school community when they do try to come back. They might feel behind academically, or they might feel like they don't fit in anymore. And at a bigger level, when a lot of kids are absent from school, it can contribute to problems within the whole community. Maybe the neighborhood starts to feel less safe, or people feel less connected to each other.
So it's like a ripple effect. It starts
Yeah.
with the individual child, but it can spread outward and affect the whole community.
Exactly. So the model is really trying to show us that this is a complex and dynamic system. It's not about just one thing causing another. It's about all these different elements interacting and influencing each other.
So we need to be thinking about all those different pieces of the puzzle. And that brings us to the third criterion, which is fluidity and flexibility. What does that mean in this context?
It means recognizing that attendance patterns and the symptoms a child might be showing, and even the underlying reasons for their absenteeism, all of that can change. It's not fixed.
So it's not like a kid is always absent for the same reason or in the same way.
Right. It's not that simple. One day, a kid might be totally absent. The next day, they might just skip a few classes. Then they might go to all their classes, no problem. And then maybe they're always late because it's hard to get going in the morning.
So it's unpredictable. It can fluctuate.
Exactly. And the reasons behind the absenteeism can change too. Maybe bullying is the big problem one week, but then later it's more about being bored with school or not connecting with the material.
So we can't assume that it's always the same thing driving the behavior.
Right. We have to stay open to the possibility that things are shifting and changing and figure one in the model.